So rate constant little k takes into account every aspect that affects the reaction rate, except for what? So that when we write the rate law up here, we say the overall rate or speed equals some constant multiplied by concentration. So we have constant that's separate from concentration. That means that K is taking into account everything except for how much reactant is present. We have to account for the concentration separately from the rate constant. Those are the two components of the rate laws. So rate constant is going to take into account everything except for the concentration of the reactant.